Okay, once again, we're back. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to a casual chat with Rupert August, Kurtz, Simon, Henry, and special guest, 6'6" England respecter.
Hello.
Or however you'd prefer to be known.
Yeah, Harry's good.
Alright, Harry works. Today, we will be talking about imperialism, mainly in a contemporary context, otherwise it's quite a rabbit hole that we could dive all the way down and stay there for quite some time. So, shall I kick us off? Or does anybody have any sort of thoughts they'd like to start with?
Imperialism was better back in the day. It was more honest and straightforward.
True, I'm sure that'll come up. Mm-hmm. Okay, so, starting off with definitions. Seeing as you read this just earlier, in preparation actually, Henry, do you want to quickly tell us what the definition of imperialism is?
You could have warned me that I needed to have that up.
Well, you don't need to have it up, but just if you, like, what you remember.
I can just read it out, I found it. Imperialism, state policy, practice, or advocacy of extending power and dominion. I can't be bothered to read the rest of it.
Okay. Over additional sort of polities or additional peoples, additional regions. That's basically what we're going to be talking about, because there is a theory of imperialism that goes something along the lines of a rule that is over multiple different distinct peoples at the same time, but that gets a little bit too messy, and you can be talking about two different things at the same time, which isn't helpful. So, I'm sure the understanding that we have of imperialism is generally that it was a thing that we did mainly up to the 19th century, and then a little bit into the 20th century, and then after that, sort of, especially towards the mid-20th century, everything started winding down. All these different countries managed to achieve their independence, and imperialism is basically a thing of the past, other than as a slur, and of course as something that we all need to apologise for. However, not so much, I dare say, because there are some ideas floating around of a neo-imperialism, which, to clarify what the definition that I would give of that, is essentially all of the benefits of imperialism in regards to being able to corner markets, extract resources, dictate policy, etc., but without any of the costly downsides that have come with it in the past, such as actually having to pay for the defence and pay for services, pay for administration, pay for infrastructure. You can get the locals to do all that instead, which makes it sound a whole lot more devious. I'm sure you would all agree.
I mean, that's because it is devious. It's really subversive.
Yeah. So one thing that I was sort of mulling on recently was how France initially sort of started off this trend, because once they'd lost Haiti, they initially tried to send an expedition to go and capture it back and turn it into a colony again. But that went particularly poorly due to the sort of tropical climate and all sorts of other difficulties with the campaign. And so they gave up on trying to hold it militarily and politically, but instead decided to control it via debt instead. So they loaned a bunch of money. The French banking sector in particular loaned a bunch of money to Haiti, the central government, and they couldn't readily pay it back. And so France imposed a bunch of stipulations on the Haitian government, particularly regarding things like provision of social services and such, and essentially controlled Haiti's policy in a soft sense, and extracted a lot of business concessions and trade concessions and such, and continued to generate revenue from them through interest repayments on the loans. And that's something that you can see a lot more in the modern day as well, with China extending its imperial reach over parts of East Africa with what have arguably been predatory loans in the past. And then what they've subsequently been able to do is, once the loans become sort of unpayable in one way or another, the Chinese government demands some sort of asset in exchange. So major ports are a good go-to.
Do you know France has what's basically amounting to a colonial tax in ex-colonial Africa, in West Africa?
A tax in what sense? I know they've got a whole bunch of, like, they've got a fairly large network of interests that they prop up in various ways, most notably recently when they intervened in Mali, I think, during an ongoing sort of civil war there, which, in the Anglosphere, it kind of came out of nowhere that France was suddenly sending ground troops to Mali, but it makes sense if you look at it as part of their sphere. But yeah, sorry, go on.
Yeah, they have quite a different attitude to the French-speaking world than we do to the Commonwealth. It comes up if you Google, make a Google search for France colonial tax. You get a lot of different stuff. They have basically most of the countries that speak French in West Africa, they all share a currency, and they're obliged to. In some places, it says that they literally just directly give France money, but it's one of those things where you can chase the citation in a circle.
Yeah.
So they're all citing each other, but the primary source is a bit iffy. But this was actually brought up by the coalition government that they had in Italy between the Five Star Movement and the League. Do you remember Paris and Rome fell out a couple of years ago quite badly over refugees?
Yes, I do recall. I'm assuming that's part of this whole trial that's been hanging over Salvini as well ever since. Side point.
Yeah, so the League are right wing and the Five Star Movement are just broadly populist. Their coalition government, because the League were the senior members in the government, were anti-mass migration of people in general, basically across the Mediterranean. And they made an argument, which I think isn't a bad argument, that the French were deliberately. It's one thing to just not have a relationship with a country that you used to colonize. I think it's still another to still be stepping on them, basically. And the French were really hindering. They still do hinder the development of West Africa, and then consequently had people leaving Niger, Mali, etc., and moving across Africa, and that was basically making the refugee crisis worse. And that's something that they were talking about in Italy, but that didn't really make it to English-speaking discourse, which is a shame, because the French get away with quite a lot to this day, I would say.
Yeah, it's part of the whole sort of language barrier thing, is that, in fact, something we were just talking about earlier is the fact that there still exists some of this sort of separate cultural sphere where just because of language barriers, certain different parts of the internet even are not necessarily talking to each other, which is a little bit odd. But side point to what we're talking about. In terms of whether or not this is a good trend, I mean, as I sort of alluded to earlier, you can look at the quote-unquote independence of a lot of these other countries in a similar vein of being predated on by particularly America throughout the late 20th century, where they were still extracting a lot of concessions in one way or another, usually through supranational organizations like the UN and the I think it's the IMF, making what could be seen as predatory loans to extract a lot of these same kinds of concessions. And in that sense, the process of decolonization looks a lot more like shifting from the British sphere of influence and from British control into American control instead, which, practically speaking, when a lot of the same people who are pulling the strings, especially at the financial level, were talking to each other anyway, is not actually that much of a difference. It's just that the way that things look on a map is a bit different. And of course, the amount of liability that the West has to police and administer these places becomes a lot more dubious. So they end up having to pay themselves, but also pay us for the benefit of being able to use the goods that we kind of semi-force on them.
Enoch Powell was right.
Yes, but what do you mean in this context?
Just my own personal meme of agreeing with the fact that Enoch Powell basically stated, I'm very much paraphrasing here, but he very much stated that that the UK shouldn't ally itself with America, shouldn't ally itself with the United States, just because we'd basically threaten to create one hell of a superpower above everybody else. And it's like, oh, lo and behold.
Yeah, America has been very predatory towards British national interests for quite some time now, but it hasn't seemed to stop our gusto with wanting to become a vassal state of them in a lot of ways.
There's kind of a point in there. Since the Suez Crisis, although you see France and Portugal pushing back on this, the Portuguese would have continued fighting in their colonies, but they had the Carnation Revolution, and the French almost had a civil war actually over the decolonization of Algeria, which has been popping up recently in French news again. President Macron is giving these sort of Macron-esque comments where 1 week he will say that the French Empire was bad, and then the next week he will say that the spreading the Enlightenment is really good, and that French culture is worth spreading to other countries and sort of flip flopping around. But the particular grievance at the moment is there were nuclear tests which were done in the Sahara, and the French government hasn't said where they took place. They've just said that we did a bunch of experiments and it's all dealt with, but they haven't told the Algerian government where in the desert the nuclear waste is buried. So any poor dude with his camel can, in theory, just bump into a big, big bunker full of buried, horrible atomic waste.
That would be pretty unfortunate.
Rip that guy.
Yeah.
But yeah, the UK, unlike France in Vietnam and Algeria, I think we were apart from Kenya, we were basically stuff it. We'll just give it all away. We'll just wash our hands with it because I think the UK was sort of morally tired of maintaining the empire. It wasn't like we were forced to ditch the empire. But then a lot of those countries ended up voting in the UN for the Soviets anyway. They had a lot of those countries, Tanzania, Ghana, ended up having left-leaning governments anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think it's entirely fair to suggest that we just gave up the empire for no good reason. The empire really fell apart after the Second World War. We had spent all our money and resources defeating the Germans, and therefore didn't have the resources necessary to maintain our colonies.
That's the thing, though. I don't think that is necessarily the case, especially because we were still throwing restorationist punches up to the Suez Crisis. But the Suez Crisis, and when America stabbed us in the back, that was the point at which America basically decided our foreign policy, and so we couldn't really turn against them. Which is why, although in previous times, and I think there still is an overarching sort of kernel of truth that we didn't want the empire anymore. I think that there probably were also some conversations that were taking place behind closed doors, rather, that were saying, here's what's going to happen. You're going to, quote unquote, grant this country independence, and they're going to enter our sphere. This being the Americans, of course, and that Britain out of that would get their economy reasonably intact, or maybe some other benefit, because America demonstrated that it was willing to just basically crash our economy if it felt like it.
Yeah. The Clement Attlee government handled India badly because I think it was recommended in a report that from 1945 that the independence of India should take at least 5 years. Obviously, it took 2 years, and famously, his name escapes me. The man who devised the border with Pakistan when they decided to create a separate Pakistani state, he'd never been to South Asia before. So that was pretty mangled, and I think that left a bad taste when it came to decolonization. But I think decolonization was an option. I think if we had wanted to maintain the empire, we could have.
If we'd really wanted to, maybe we could have really pushed the issue, but I think it would have been resisting. It would have been against the will of America, for one thing, which would have been a very bad trajectory to take. And after we lost Suez decisively, that made it very difficult just in terms of communication lines and all that kind of thing. So if there was some kind of bubbling up in some other sector of the empire that we had to respond to militarily, we would kind of be at the mercy of Nasser, whether he felt like helping us out or whether he wanted to support the rebels instead, which is just a very dangerous place to be.
Sure.
But this comes to an overarching point, which is that there are two ways of looking at this, which is that all of this talk of financials and diplomatic wrangling and such, there's one argument that says this has kind of always been how empire happened. So particularly you could look at the conquest of India and how it was done by a private corporation rather than as something that the British government set out to do. And so, maybe this is how it's always been. But the other is that this whole Neo-Imperialism thing is just really lame. It's just very aesthetically unappealing and just kind of gross. So, I don't know. I feel like that's probably going to factor into this conversation somehow, because this connotation that we have, either looking at it fondly or with revulsion, depending on which political wing you're from, perhaps, of rocking up to someone else's shores and then Yeah, so this old perception of just rocking up to someone else's shores with a big army and just conquering them and deciding that you are their property now and doing that via sort of force of will and might, as sort of comes up in some right-wing authors, particularly Evola, I think, talks about this, and probably Nietzsche. Seems like the kind of thing that Nietzsche would have talked about. But yeah, this idea that you're going to dominate some other people with your will and your superior spirit and all of that kind of thing, that just is not a factor anymore, basically.
Yeah, so since 1945, it's basically been taboo or illegal to take over countries or other parts of countries by force, and like the justification is we can. But interestingly enough, we slightly saw this come undone recently when Israel claimed the Golan Heights, which they de facto have occupied for decades. And their justification was a weird justification. It was basically, if we don't occupy the Golan Heights, terrorists from Palestine or from Syria will attack us from the Golan Heights. So they made a purely security argument, which is kind of weird because we can occupy Aden again just on the virtue of there being a civil war in Yemen. It doesn't quite work like that. But it's interesting that there seems to be a sort of slow. We see this with China. Obviously, the People's Republic of China is pretty thirsty for Taiwan at the moment, which really is colonized by Han people because there are indigenous people to Taiwan.
But I think it's a tiny minority now, as I recall.
We're seeing a sort of slow degradation, like a slow come down from imperialist wars are completely taboo. But I would say we're basically still in the post-war period of imperialism. Expansion is bad.
It does seem like there's a resurrection of the natural borders arguments, but kind of without saying it, because the Golan Heights are a sort of natural border between Syria and Israel. It's just a case of who holds the strategic defensive position to make it their border rather than the border being at the foothills or something. A similar thing goes for Taiwan, with the fact that it's so close to Chinese shores and it's a constant sort of threat unless they can secure it. So imperial conquest of Ireland when?
And
it's a back door into Britain. It's just not safe.
Exactly.
To maybe bring this on to talking about neo-imperialism versus imperialism, I think the come down of being against imperialism is also partly due to the fact that people are starting to become more aware of how neo-imperialism works. When you actually explain the concept to a relative normie, they actually get kind of disgusted, and to a point where I've heard a few of them literally say they prefer the old way of imperialism because at least it was direct, it was upfront, there was no backhanded, there was no deceit. And the deceit is sometimes what rubs people worse than the act itself.
I mean, I'm sure many here will remember about a year ago when the Hong Kong protests were taking place, a lot of people were calling for Hong Kong to be returned under British rule, just because Hong Kong was better under British rule than it has been under the Chinese rule in the past few years.
Yeah, I mean...
Sorry, I suppose, the difference with that, and it sort of highlights the difference between a lot of, I guess you could call it European colonialism, whatever we want to call the older system, is that Britain's occupation of Hong Kong, or colonization of Hong Kong, was with the express sort of knowledge that it would be a colony and that's how it would stay. It was a separate entity, and there was no interest in, wiping out whatever people groups were there or, integrating it into the United Kingdom somehow. It was all just sort of, okay, you can do your own thing so long as you are our colony, basically. Whereas with the Chinese, that's a bad word, the current system in Hong Kong, it's sort of with the understanding of, okay, well, you can have your democracy, you can have your capitalism, you can do whatever you want for now, but it's on a time limit because you want to be part of mainland China pretty soon, relatively speaking, at least.
I mean, this does touch on something else though, which is that there are different ways of doing imperialism, which is that there's a left imperialism and there's a right imperialism, and both had their time to shine in the 19th century in particular. So you had the sort of liberal paternalistic arguments for imperialism, where we need to invest resources into these places because it's like a moral duty. We need to uplift these people and bring them up to the level of civilization. And then there's the right argument for imperialism, where we are stronger, therefore we deserve to be able to do what we want with these places and extract whatever resources and maintain it to be mighty in itself effectively. So just because this sort of barrier is breaking down of that is stopping us from engaging in imperialism doesn't necessarily mean, especially with the current climate, that we'd be getting back a form of imperialism that is going to be like muscular and aggressive. It might just as readily be doing things like leaning much more hard into this overt neo-imperialism, perhaps, that revolves around things like foreign aid and colonizing with ideas, colonizing their brains, as I put it in a previous episode. And that's kind of what France is talking about. So it probably just means that we'd be going more down that sphere. So, we'd see places like Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, like former British colonies potentially that are, comparably underdeveloped. See those places seeing more, or see those places having more like British foreign aid and things, and like deliberately sent over bureaucrats and things to help out their administration with very little prestige, or particularly in the side of military prestige, but like very, very little glory brought to us. That's the danger, I suppose.
I want to throw in a hot potato.
Oh.
Is when you mention left imperialism, obviously we know that in the 19th century, one of the main justifications for ending slavery, or what for colonizing Africa, was to end slavery. It was like we had this revelation and banned slavery in the Caribbean, and then we were like, now we're going to do it in Africa, in places outside the Queen's sovereignty. Yeah, since 2020, it's been basically one of the worst things that you can be called, I guess, in general at the moment, is racist. But the statute, we see like the emphasis on slavery as being, and like slavery is like one of the worst things, but it's often a criticism of slavery which is sort of mixed in with a criticism of empire, despite those two in most of the 19th century being contrasts. There is slavery right now in Africa. I feel like some people don't really recognize this. Like if you go to Malta is not very far from Tripoli in Libya, and you can, I think I can say this on the podcast, you can buy people in Tripoli. I think you can buy like African people quite brazenly in most of Libya at the moment, because since Gaddafi there isn't like a centralized Libyan government. And yeah, it's like a very oppressive attitude towards African migrants that they have in North Africa, in Libya. One wonders like how the public would feel if you sort of span this in a way where you could say, we all agree slavery is bad, we're going to end slavery. Whether people would realise, because obviously that would be quite good optics, whether people would realise that that would basically be just a direct revival of the 19th century. I feel like there's sort of an ignorance of why the colonization of Africa happened, because we banned slavery. You could just completely reproduce that same argument today to ban slavery in Africa, because there's still quite a lot of slavery.
I think it's mainly to do with narrative at this stage, and it's also the fact that like I feel like as much as you try to spin it that way, you've then got to somehow convince people that it's worth the resources to do such a thing. Like there might be people who are like, yes, we should end slavery, but we don't want to sink in the resources for that. And also that the most people now, who I'm just going to call them what they are, deluded into thinking that like we're still in some sort of like weird modern day slave reparation thing. They're kind of they're just in their own like delusion, and they are armchair activists. They want to quote unquote fix the problems in massive quotation marks of their own country, because it's something that they have an immediate effect on, trying to affect civil issues in another country is incredibly difficult.
Mm.
Less said
And
about
also-
Coney 2012, the better.
Also, as an aside as well, as you mentioned that basically slavery is still going on, I think what is kind of disturbing and what people were not allowed to sink in is the idea that, people want to make it out as if the Atlantic slave trade was like one of the worst, crimes against humanity, when it's like modern day slavery dwarfs that by many times. I think it's something ridiculous, like nearly 10 times. There's nearly 10 times as much slavery now than there ever was through the Atlantic slave trade.
There was a T-shirt which Beyonce, the pop singer, was promoting in America, and it had a woke comment on, like this is what I think it was this is what a feminist looks like. This was probably about 8 years ago. It was like one of the feminism good, or BLM good, one of those like sort of proto virtue signaling branding things. And a journalist did like a very surface level scoop into origins of said T-shirt, and they were like being manufactured by the tens of thousands in really dodgy sweatshops in Bengal by people being paid like £2 a day or something.
Classic. I mean, to your point though, I think that what with all the moral outrage, we probably are one concerted media campaign away from what you said, basically the exact same trajectory of the scramble for Africa, or at least a very similar, where we go out on a moral crusade basically because the public is thrown up into a frenzy, and I can't see the right being able to mount a proper coherent defense against that if the left is going to be so fully on board. And in some ways, it would probably represent something like a synthesis of like right and left perspectives, in that the left would be getting their sort of like moral dominance, and the right would be getting their sort of projection of raw power, even if it's for a slightly dubious end of eradicating their culture and imposing white supremacist values like maybe don't enslave each other.
So what you're saying is this is a great idea for everyone involved and we should get on it immediately.
No, that's not quite what I'm saying. It's a prediction with a morally neutral outlook, or like a neutral opinion on it. But I don't think that there would be a very strong resistance to put up from there. It would be diehard anti-war people, because most of the people who would usually be filling out the streets in protests against the war wouldn't really have their normal sort of moral leg to stand on if it's to end slavery, which is the like metaphysical ill that needs to be rid from the universe right now.
I mean, you had me at Crusade, by the way.
Based.
Deus vote, Deus vote, Deus vote, Deus vote.
I'm not... Sorry, go on.
Yeah, please don't get me cancelled. Can I just throw in a sort of Marxist question of when we talk about like defining slavery, there is a very high birth rate in, I mean, it's called quote unquote the developing world, isn't it? Which is quite an odd euphemism, I think. So the value of labor is very low in Nigeria, in Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, in China still. How do we differentiate like legal slavery from wage slavery, from people who work for like such small amounts of money? It also happens in the Gulf, actually. The Arab Gulf countries are very bad for bringing in lots of people from Bangladesh to do construction projects like football stadiums and big macroeconomic projects. And the conditions that those people sleep in are, they're sleeping on the floor. They've got a pillow and then they're like sleeping on the concrete at the construction site. It feels like in most of the world, we've banned slavery only for capitalism to just develop in such a way that people are still being obviously, I'm not talking about like you work in Waterstones. Obviously, that's not exploitation. But like the people who work in these horrible, sweaty factories in Bengal, where there was actually a horrific building collapse about 10 years ago in Bangladesh, where said building was so structurally unsound, and I think they were women that were making the t-shirts. They slept in the building overnight, and the building collapsed, and like 1,000 people died or something crazy.
Well, ignoring the building, there is an interesting point there where there's a line to be drawn somewhere, and I can't exactly tell you where it is, between just a normal 9-to-5 job and actual slavery. I think it's much closer to obviously the sweatshop workers. I'm not saying that working a 9-to-5 job is slavery, though. I'm sure that some people would say that. But yeah, I agree that it's not. Well, I'm not sure what your opinion on it is, to be honest. But in my opinion, the line is definitely somewhere within the very low wage labour sort of sweatshop level, rather than before that in the straight slavery and only slavery is counting.
Yeah.
Because so you bring up a lot of the low labour cost countries. There's the thing that I've heard is in going off on a bit of a tangent, but in Brazil, they were in a similar sort of position to China at one point, but they couldn't quite get their labour costs down far enough to actually be any sort of decent manufacturing hub. So what you ended up getting was, by and large, people getting paid more, but not nearly the level of traffic and industry that you would have seen otherwise. So in theory, they are in a better position because they're being paid more, but they are in a much poorer country for it.
Yeah, this has been part of the deliberate economic calculation of China, is that they are keeping a lot of their workers deliberately poor to the extent that they can remain nationally competitive.
Mm.
Is it called like the middle power problem? So there's actually a term for it. It's called like the
middle income trap.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so it's where labour costs have risen to the extent, and wages by extension, have risen to such an extent that you can't compete on low-cost labour anymore, or low-cost industry anymore, but productivity hasn't risen to the level where you can compete on high productivity. So you're just kind of stuck in the middle where you just lack competitiveness in either area.
Mm.
Brazil suffered from this quite badly. But I'm going to take it back to the original point about slavery and where the line is drawn, and kind of come in with an outside take that the difference is basically entirely rhetorical. Like even at the time that we conceptualized slavery, a lot of slaves had it far better than even their contemporary wage workers, but they weren't owned, and so we categorize slavery as horrible and unconscionable, where the workers were like perfectly free normal wage laborers, even though the wage laborers were expected to work more under worse conditions and often received fewer benefits for it.
It's the difference between being solely responsible for yourself, meaning you have to look after yourself, whereas if someone else is effectively your custodian, then it is in their best interest to look after you.
Yeah, they have a long-term reason to keep you healthy and such. But the implications of that are kind of interesting, because it means that this moral crusade that I was talking about earlier could go basically anywhere. Once we get into this mode of thinking where we need to go and liberate other less developed countries from their slavery, enslaving their own people, then yeah, we totally could go to Bangladesh, because they could make a compelling argument that the working conditions that a lot of those people are working in are tantamount to slavery, and it's basically the same. Especially if we carry on going down this sort of like generational anti-capitalist trajectory that we've been on for the last couple of generations. Not full generations, but what I mean with the millennials and the Zoomers both kind of like taking anti-capitalist stances compared to their predecessors.
So, yeah. Rupert, are you saying we should bring back indentured servitude contracts?
Yes, but that wasn't explicitly the point I was making just now.
I suppose I'm not entirely convinced, to be honest, that such a crusade would actually work. We've already seen enough movements talking about the sort of going against the sort of sweatshop working conditions and trying to get people to stop buying things like Primark and a lot of like the big like chain brands, whatever. But it just doesn't seem to go anywhere. It seems to fizzle out very quickly.
Don't get me wrong. I don't think it would work. but I think it would happen anyway. As in, we would go there and we would take over their country with the express aim of, or at least, take over, at least take away their sovereignty, start dictating policy to them somewhat, over this issue of slavery. We wouldn't be able to stamp out the slavery completely because there's probably some pretty significant structural reasons for it. And if everybody involved still, at that level, still wants to take part in the institution, then, what are we going to do unless we're going to police every street corner, which we're probably not going to do. But yeah, like I said, that wouldn't stop us from going in there and, smashing up their country a little bit for the sake of moral posturing.
This sounds very based.
Not really. It doesn't really benefit anyone. We're just kind of going in there and smashing their country for basically no reason, except to feel good.
Benefits people who enjoy smashing things.
So we've touched on left imperialist rationale and right imperialism, which is what we more typically think of, invading people just to flex. I'd like to just throw in another cultural spanner. Obviously there are different ways you can dress up imperialism. If imperialism is one place taking over another place, I think if there was a caliphate, like an Islamic caliphate, that would probably be imperialism, like a modern caliphate, which the odds of that I wouldn't put at 0.
Well, I mean, arguably we're kind of living under the American cultural caliphate, whereby particularly the Anglo countries are all extremely downstream from American culture. I mean, we all have to care about what happens in American politics because it affects us stupidly, annoyingly, and American cultural output is something that pretty significantly affects our sort of national conversations and even person-to-person conversations. What American films come out from year to year. So insofar as they have a cultural empire, the Anglosphere in particular, but also large portions of the rest of the world. Anytime you've met somebody who has English as their second language and speaks it with an American accent, probably learnt it from films and interacting with American media and American culture in some way. So yeah, I could very much see a similar thing happening elsewhere.
I was talking about a literal.
I get that.
Caliphate.
Yeah.
But yeah, we do live under the cultural thumb of the United States, which I would say is mostly bad, 3/4 bad. Lots of fast food, emphasis on gender and race, identity politics, which is just doing absolute nightmarish things to the perceptions of young, normie people in the UK and Canada and other parts of Western Europe.
Yeah, we got to have all of our statues torn down because of something that happened in America.
Yeah, I don't really know how we can avoid that. It just seems to come with the dominance of America that we are basically like a 51st state, like a little satellite state of the USA.
To be fair, I wouldn't even. I wouldn't even go to the level of America. I mean, most of it's coming out of California and a lot of the big metropolitan centers in America.
Yeah, they call the Midwest the flyover states, right?
Yeah.
These are the places that people on the coast, the Democrats on the coastlines, don't actually drive through, or they just fly over them in a plane because they're going from LA to New York.
Notice there that they were demoted from people to Democrats.
Flora and fauna.
Jesus. When you say about defending yourself from it or defending a country from the intersectionalist nonsense that's spouting out of the US, I almost feel like your best bet is to try and inoculate yourself like France has tried to do in some senses, because they're usually being the key word here, usually quite defensive of their culture and their institutions, though obviously I'm very much being proven wrong by the last 2 decades.
Well, the advantage that France has is that they speak a different language, whereas we don't necessarily have that luxury.
Yeah, but also France does have a very big, not only speaking their own language, but they also seem to be or have appeared to be in the past very adamant about being French.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure France has a government body dedicated to making sure the French language is not influenced from outside sources too much
Yeah.
to help them keep their identity. And that's the problem with us living in a state that is constantly trying to be subverted by people within it. That no one's trying to protect Englishness at the moment. That
Yes.
everyone's too interested in tearing it down. That makes the American influence dig its claws in even deeper. There's no resistance.
So the French have I think it's a college for trying to keep the French language as
French as possible.
as static. It doesn't really change much. Whereas we have it's the English dictionary of usage. It's by what is used. So if people say wagwan, then wagwan becomes English. If people stop saying scrumping, do you guys know scrumping? It's like picking.
Is that similar to poggers?
No.
Is this a southern thing that I'm too far north to understand?
Don't say poggers.
Oh, come on, even I've heard of scrumping.
It's like picking. It's like
when you go and steal apples.
Yeah, exactly. It's like an archaic English word for specifically stealing apples illegally from someone else's orchard.
That doesn't sound very cash money to me.
Oh no.
And it's really funny because then it made it into other parts of the English language for a while, where I believe that at one point there was a turn of phrase of someone saying, yeah, me and the lads used to go scrumping, and of course everyone's like, oh, what, stealing apples, that's not a big deal. It's like, no, we didn't go scrumping for apples, we went scrumping for cars.
So,
derailed
from our casual chat on apple stealing. I think where you see a lot more of the cultural impact or cultural imperialism, I guess, is in the more sort of developing nations that we've been talking about. Like a lot of, I suppose what we'd call American culture being, their corporations and their big sort of blockbuster films. That is more what gets exported to places like India and China and stuff. Like
they don't seem to be able to organically create culture. What I mean by that is, obviously we have traditions because we're a lot older than the USA, but we have things which come about over time. They're not like forced, and they're not done because of like the profit motive. Whereas in the USA, their culture is, and in the USA this is like white. I don't know why it's white culture, as opposed to African American culture or Hispanic culture, which probably I would say is more organic because it's just comes from those communities. The corporations in America produce, like they have the pop singers don't write their own music. They have people who are the professional songwriters, and they make songs which are. I think Roger Scruton had something about this. He was going on a rant once about the sophistication of songs is at a certain low level. So it's basically like as bass as not based.
They're all hitting the same four chords, and there really is only four things modern pop music is about. It's either about partying, being in a relationship, being depressed, or having broken up from your relationship. and that's really all you're getting from modern pop music.
While it also attempts to emulate what was popular in the past, like that's how little creativity there is. It's usually following the coattails of something good, like how. For a while, I remember there was a real... I've forgotten who it was, but it's someone who, even at the time, got called a hack because he kept doing, like, remixes of Daft Punk songs.
We, just even in, like, contemporary UK pop culture, we had the show The In-Betweeners. The USA then made a version of The In-Betweeners, which is absolutely dire, and there's a good YouTube video that compares the two. They tried to, just transport it over, but Americanize the jokes, and it didn't work cross-culturally. They also famously took The Office, which I'm quite salty about, because the philosophy of the show, The Office, is that it's meant to be a fly-on-the-wall thing where people were like filming in the office just for a documentary. And then when you see the US version of The Office, it drags on for several more seasons than journalists would plausibly film a documentary. The USA just seems to sort of pinch bits from British culture and then not really come up with its own culture unless it's there's a lot of Netflix shows at the moment about white privilege. Like, it doesn't actually seem to be a very constructive cultural idea. You know, I kind of wouldn't be bothered with American cultural imperialism. I'm sure I'll get in stick with you guys about this, but like, if the USA was exporting a culture to us that was half decent, then it would be less worse.
I mean, it's almost like a non-culture, really. That's its problem. Like you say, America is so comparatively young to other countries, especially in Europe. They don't really have some great history to draw from that has borne some like this deep the same sort of deep cultural identity that you find in European countries. There's no ancient traditions. The closest thing I can think of is in America is getting shot at high noon by an Arizona Ranger.
Yeah, so when you mention like what they export through things like Netflix, that just got the gears turning for me along the lines of, not only, like you say, do Netflix shows have this like thing about white privilege, but I've also noticed that nearly all of them revolve around the concept of X character is really depressed, and then I think about how technically that's a through line that's originated all the way back into those westerns, into getting shot at high noon by an Arizona Ranger, because usually in those westerns the protagonist is usually from the Civil War era or something, and was either part of the losing side or part of a losing battle, and he is depressed and cynical, and he reflects that in the world around him. And then even when you think about like the noir style crime noir, even that is full of cynicism, despite the kind of romantic element to it.
So what we've pinned down here is that American culture is based mainly around the idea of depression.
Depression and cynicism, yes.
Media certainly reflects it. A lot of things are starting to make a lot more sense now.
And then you're wondering why everyone in our country is becoming cynical and depressed.
Just on that point about 5 minutes ago when we were talking about American cultural imperialism in developing countries, it's quite vexing how, like, if you look at the photography of the people who moved to New York before the First World War, the immigration authorities took photos of the men, women, and children who arrived. Where were they processed? Was it Long Island?
Yeah, that's the one.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
I thought it was
Pretty sure.
I thought it was like Staten Island or something.
Oh no, yeah.
I don't know. Either way, whichever way it is.
And there's these lovely pre-First World War photos of people from different countries in Europe, and a few countries on the periphery of Europe, from like different parts of the Ottoman Empire. And you can see that they're all wearing their national dress. It's really cool. Like Frisian, like different parts of the Netherlands, like Frisian or like Holland clothing, Catalan clothing, different parts of Portugal. Obviously, like most of Europe used to have clothing that basically like everyone in that country wore. Polish women wear, it's like all white with red by their breast, right? Like Dutch women have these like crazy like hats, or they kind of look like milkmaids, and all of that was rubbed away after the Second World War by like the mass production of like jeans. Now we have hoodies. Basically everyone in the world looks the same.
Yeah, I mean, you get barely contracted tribes in the tropics that are wearing bloody jeans and t-shirts.
Yeah, or like you see people wearing branded clothing with like different like Tesco on, and you're like, do you know what Tesco is?
Mm-hmm.
But it's kind of monstrous because it has no sort of like meaning. It has no like deeper meaning to it. It's just like you've bought it from your clothing store. Whereas people used to wear clothes which identified them with their particular country, which I think was nice before globalization.
I mean, to Marx's point, it's the like pure commodification of ever more different types of goods, where everything just becomes about like complete interchangeability and like cost reduction at all costs and pure utility, nothing else. I mean, that's the same with the media. That's what we were talking about earlier. The subtext being that, it's been drilled down to this, like, these 4 subjects of songs that resonate with the most amount of people in, like, a demographic marketing sense. So we're just going to produce the same 4 outlines of songs over and over with slightly different lyrics, using the same handful of chords, because that's what, like, the most efficient commodity music is. Like staring into the abyss.
It's all immensely depressing stuff.
It's interesting how, because I was just thinking about, like, people in Africa and people in Asia compared to the American Empire and Europe, culturally, economically. It's interesting how quite a lot of and I've spoken with you before about this, Rupert, on Twitter in DMs, that a lot of the decolonization leaders were nationalists. Like, I mean, obviously they were nationalists, but from the Eurocentric point of view, they're just either in the non-aligned movement or in the Soviet or Chinese blocs. We just call them, like, they're communists or they're far left. But in their own right, like, if we were to take them out of the context of the Cold War, a lot of them were, like, trying to return to tradition. Some of them were, like, really committed to the pre-European culture of their countries, which, I mean, really, like, if we could get back pre-American global culture in Europe, that would be nice. Like, it doesn't seem wildly different in the intent to throw back global capital. I don't know if that's a stretch.
I mean, you certainly get a large coalition to press for that, but the discrepancy in resources would obviously be pretty huge between those 2 different movements. I mean, ultimately, yeah, that's what I'd prefer. I guess we've turned this all the way around, talking about imperialism, with the implication that we would be the imperialists to no, we are the colonized.
When the USA was... Oh, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say top 10 anime twists.
And I was just thinking how it's like, oh god, mass-produced genes are just neo-colonialism. Neo-Imperialism.
Yeah. When the USA was an isolationist country, like, they were already a big industrial country in the 1920s, but they hadn't just completely swamped the world with their culture. I suppose you could call it a culture. It's like
their cringeworthy ways.
The lack of culture being imposed on the world.
Yeah,
Ooh.
Culture as lack of culture.
Yikes.
I mean, this is the whole thing with globalization. This thing I remember. I mean, we've looked at this a decent amount, just casually. You and I, Rupert, with architecture. A lot of, especially in Europe, architecture completely changing over the years, where different countries and cities would have very distinct architectural styles. Sort of like Germanic Gothic styles compared to the Roman architecture or like old French style architecture that you'd find in different cities around the world, and it would instantly identify that as coming from a certain place and being built in a certain time, to every modern city having the exact same skyline because it's just the exact same 100-story high glass skyscrapers stamped down into the landscape over and over and over again, where there's no unique identifying cultural feature there. You can't say, yes, this is clearly of Germanic design. It's like, nope, this is yet another glass rectangle stretching into the sky over and over again.
I mean, that's almost preferable to what we get now as modern interpretist architecture.
I don't know.
But we went over that before anyway.
Yeah, that sounds like choosing
how
between...
much of a hell site London is.
Yeah, that sounds like choosing between hemlock and cyanide. Neither, please. Well, on that depressing note, unless anybody else has got any final points, we could wrap it up there, probably.
So we're recolonizing Africa and we're binning the United States.
We might recolonize.
Ideally.
We might recolonize Africa.
I'm lobbying that we bring back indentured servitude contracts.
Well, I think just trying to nudge America on its little retreat into isolationism would be a good start. If the imperialism is going to happen, then sure, I guess send in the anti-slavery activists and they can fight that war themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Step 2 can be burning all the pop culture t-shirts.
Anyway, good chat, everyone. I enjoyed that. Speak to you all later.